The 17th century mathematician and mystic Blaise Pascal was riding in a carriage when the axle broke. He came near to being killed. He realized all of a sudden how close to death we always are at every moment. Now, he realized this in a way that was far different from the way we learn and are taught. He realized it in a way that no learning can take the place of. That's one existentialist theme. That is the difference between mere learning and vital knowing. The more fundamental existentialist theme in this story, this theme of which Pascal became suddenly and viscerally aware, is, as I said, the theme of our constant closeness to imminent death. In the corpus of existentialist writing, this theme is spoken of as our facticity, our thrownness into life, our thrownness in what Heidegger calls our Geworfenheit. These are themes which Professor Barrett has often emphasized, and it is he who is largely responsible for first bringing them to the attention of American readers. Now, if a smile were not a piece of stupid cruelty on my part, I would point out the irony of Professor Barrett's own situation. A brilliant writer and teacher, scheduled to give a lecture on Geworfenheit, on thrownness, and being himself thrown onto the ice on which he breaks his ankle. Now, as I admit, the attempt to find irony in this is really in bad taste. It's stupid. Nevertheless, it's the kind of irony which someone like Kierkegaard might have enjoyed. An even more sobering irony, of course, is that I'm here to take Barrett's place. And therein lies another existentialist theme, one with which existentialists criticize modern Western culture as a whole. One man can never really take the place of another or stand for another. Society, of course, keeps on insisting that it is possible for one man to take another man's place. And the price of progress is anonymity. We're replaceable, and we have no name. But in our private lives, the one area in which we can rebel against anonymity with a somewhat better hope of success, we know that this is just not so. Voter X may be indistinguishable from voter Y. Worker X may be indistinguishable from worker Y. For some of us, even lover X may be indistinguishable from lover Y. I know that I, as a teacher, often do not distinguish between student X and student Y, and that is what is called being fair. But we can't do this with spouses, for example. We can't say, your husband has died, here, have another. This separates the important areas from the trivial ones, the areas of irreplaceability from that of the statistic, the social role, the function, that which Heidegger calls das Mann. The Mann here doesn't mean man in the generic sense. Mann is like the French word on dit. Man spricht, one does, the one, the anonymous, one does this. Now you can see the powerful force that a term of this sort can exercise. In Germany, one tells one's children, so benimmt man sich nicht. One doesn't. One must conform to this man. Totally abstract. Who is it? Do you ever see this man? Does one see the one walking down the street? Does one see man walking down the street? Is there ever an example of man? No. Fortunately or unfortunately. For Kierkegaard and for Heidegger, das Mann is the unreal. Kierkegaard wanted only one phrase on his tombstone. He wanted to be called the individual. This is for him a very, very painful achievement. Individuality was not something that he was in any way comfortable with. As a matter of fact, Kierkegaard would have wanted nothing better than the good, solid, safe, quiet, bourgeois marriage with Regina Olsen. He left her, couldn't marry at all. Perhaps because he couldn't live in Das Mann. There must have been other reasons, I'm sure. Now, what does all this show us? Well, something like Das Mann, you see, can be used as a justification for Auschwitz. It can be used as a justification for Vietnam. They are doing it. It is done. Not I. I was non-political. I didn't partake. They did it. They. Whom shall we blame? They, you see, certainly not me, not myself. Now, in doing this, our culture and our morality makes it possible for us to live inauthentically, in an unreal, inhuman fashion. And it's therefore possible to say, as Jean-Paul Sartre does, that morality is bad faith. You see how paradoxical this is. The Ten Commandments, Charlton Heston bringing them down from the mountainside, the Word of God. This is really bad faith. The only answer, therefore, is to say, as Nietzsche and Sartre do, that God is dead. And they're not crying about this at all. They're very happy. They say this is a liberation. When Jean-Paul Sartre landed here at the airport, he got off the plane and, hat in hand, bestowed upon us this great piece of news from nowhere. God is dead. God is dead. Live. See, God is dead. We're condemned to be free. Also a very paradoxical situation. Now, as to this relation of the individual to Das Mann, what does all this show us? It shows us that there's a profound difference between the area in which we really live and the area in which we are merely understood as replaceable items. Merely understood, that is, by the sciences. In the Middle Ages, this difference was known as the difference between essence and existence. Essence is the meaning that things have or are given. Existence is the brute fact of their occupying space and their bones breaking when they fall. The existence of a thing is entirely different, you see, from the meaning that it has. Now, the entire history of our intellectual endeavors in the West has been a history of reaching for essences, of grasping meanings, of achieving understanding. But look at the verbs I've just used. Reaching, grasping, achieving. We use these graphic three-dimensional verbs to describe processes that are anything but a grasp in the physical sense. Existentialism has reversed all this. It has realized that meanings are always secondary to the life from which they are derived, and secondary to the life which these meanings seek to control in the name of science and sophistication. Existentialism, so we are told in glib articles, puts existence before essence. What does this mean? Well, here's an example of such a difference. So far, I'm reading this lecture. I began to write it with some notion of timing it, since this is a broadcast. That means I wrote this before I got here, before I made any contact with you. In other words, here I am, existing, yet giving you the essence of existentialism. Now see the difference. My reality, my existence, is something entirely different from the essence which I'm imparting. We philosophers, of course, are never bothered by this conflict. I should say, we philosophers of the Anglo-American tradition, because the English and the Americans are one, and the people on the continent are quite something else. Did you know, by the way, that the Atlantic Ocean is only 18 miles wide, while the English Channel is 3,000 miles wide? Peculiar reversal. Now we philosophers, we have managed to ignore existentialism, except, of course, for the course which we must teach once in a while in it. No, we are logical positivists, linguistic analysts. That is our training. We read existentialism in private, perhaps, for our education. It's a situation somewhat resembling that of psychology. In the colleges, we teach behaviorism or physiological psychology. But for treatment, we go to the Freudians. But now I'll stop reading. Now, do you hear the difference in the sound of my voice? It's a lot like one of the titles that Barrett gave to a collection of writings on Zen. The collection is called Zen Flesh, Zen Bones. It's this flesh and bone business, you see, that we have somehow to reconcile with our intellect, to put back into the center of intellectual discussion. And the sciences, as I'll show you, don't do this. Because as Kierkegaard pointed out, life is lived forward, it is understood backward. And here is the vital split, the vital critical abyss, which we never span. Other cultures can, of course. We never have, or if at all, intermittently and with difficulty. This is why something like Zen Buddhism has now become very popular. But of course we can't possibly embrace it with the same degree of reality and conviction as genuine Buddhists. Now, let me get back for a moment to this medieval distinction between essence and existence. In the Middle Ages, the essence of something, as I said, is entirely different from the existence of something. What does this mean? This means that when you define something, you give its essences. And its existence is never part of its definition. You can define a horse and say it's a certain kind of animal with warm eyes and a tail answering to the name of, and so on. But you never say a horse is an existing creature with such and such properties. You can say a dinosaur is a reptile type of thing, so many feet high, but you never say it exists. Existence, therefore, is never included in the definition of anything at all. Existence never adds to the meaning of anything. Conceptually speaking, as Kant pointed out, there's no difference between 100 real and 100 imaginary dollars. The concept is the same. Close your eyes, put the two of them side by side. You can't imagine the difference between 100 real and 100 imaginary, not counterfeit, but imaginary dollars. For example, if you ask me to paint a picture of a horse, I'd go to the stables a number of times, make sketches of his stance, the way he holds his head, the texture of his coat, the way his tail hangs, and then I'd do the painting. And then I'd submit it to the patron. The patron couldn't possibly say, you got a stance all right, and you got that soulful look in his eye, but you didn't get his existence. Didn't paint his existence. This can't be depicted, you see. So there is a split between the two. Now, this is a very disturbing and very fantastic admission for the medieval world to make and to accept, because for them, the world itself is suffused with meaning. There's meaning on all sides. But existence is never part of that meaning, except for God. God alone can say, I am. God alone can say, ego sum, as he does in Exodus, at the scene of the burning bush. When the voice in the bush commands Moses to liberate the children of Israel, and Moses turns and is about to pick up his shoes and says, who shall I say sent me? It's very important, you see, to get the name of the God, because in primitive religions, the name of the God defines the God's power. As in Homer, we speak of Poseidon, earth-shaker. Well, God doesn't want to define himself. God doesn't want to give himself a name, because as soon as he does, he limits himself. To define, you see, is to put a finitude, a limitation on something. To call something Harry means that it isn't Tom. To call something male is to say it isn't female. Therefore, if God were to give himself a name, he'd be limiting himself. So he just says, tell them I am. Tell them I am sent you. Tell them I am that I am. My existence is my meaning. And for God alone is this possible. For the Middle Ages, therefore, only God can say ego sum. The rest of us derive our being in a more unreal way. We participate in God's being somehow, but only God is real. Now comes Descartes in the 17th century, and suddenly the fundamental thing is that man says ego sum. The first thing that Descartes is certain of is that he exists. Then he goes on to prove the existence of God. But first of all, me, Descartes. Well, this introduction of the ego, you see, is very important. You can see this difference in the difference between medieval painting and Renaissance painting. Medieval painters don't sign their names to their work. Never. The stained glass windows never have signatures. But the Renaissance artists, you see, stick their names on things. As a matter of fact, Michelangelo, in that first Pieta that he did, the one that was here in the World's Fair, when there seemed to be some question as to who would get credit for it, the man who ran the studio was saying, "I did it and the kid helps me," or something like that. The story goes that Michelangelo sneaked in at night, took a hammer and chiseled across the band that the Madonna wears across her chest. "I, Michelangelo Buonarroti of Florence, I made this." There's the great signature of all time. The ego is introduced. Now we become aware of ourselves. Now this introduces all kinds of problems immediately. The ego is something which is rejected by Hume and by Kant, but in a different way. Certainly, behavioristic psychologists reject such a thing altogether. Freud retains it, but Freud is, well, we're all agreed, aren't we, that Freud is a primitive. But behavioristic psychologists don't accept such a thing as mind, and certainly they don't accept such a thing as a personality. And there's no real difference, you see, that we can discern between a flesh and bone human being and an intricately worked, intricately made robot that would look exactly like a human being. We don't know what a personality is, what an ego is, or even if there is such a thing at all. Now, this introduces an era which Albert Camus calls humiliated thought. What's happened ever since Descartes, and Descartes is the founder of modern philosophy, what's happened ever since Descartes is the limitation of knowledge, the rejection of knowledge. We are far more interested now, as philosophers, in what we cannot know than we are interested in knowing anything. It appears as though we have, the typical fright that all men have of being deceived. We'd rather not enjoy. It's the same sort of thing that Kierkegaard goes through in rejecting Regina Olsen, you see. If you reject the girl, there's no chance at all of you ever being deceived. And this is humiliated thought. This is the limitation of thought now. And this is, as I said, what has happened ever since Kant. The upshot of this you can find in something like T.S. Eliot's The Hollow Man, when he says something like, I forget how the verse goes, lips that would kiss form prayers to broken stone. And here we all stand on the banks of the tumid river, quite silent, quite speechless, and the world ends not with a bang, but a whimper. And it isn't. And when Eliot reads that, he doesn't even say it majestically. He just says, not with a bang, but a whimper, just like that. It's trivial. That's the way it ends, you see. Now, in this light, the absurd is seen as an answer to this and as a culmination. But there is also a way of looking at the absurd as Camus and Sartre do. Looking at the absurd as the great opening out, the great liberating force. There's a story by Ernest Hemingway, which is quoted in Professor Barrett's wonderful little book, Irrational Man. The story is called A Clean, Well-Lighted Place. It's a story set in Havana, and the hero runs a coffee bar, if I remember correctly. And he's cleaning the place up and locking up for the night, you see, and he sent his helper home. And he's wiping down the stainless steel counter, and there's fluorescent lighting. It's a clean, well-lighted place, orderly, clean. It's, of course, a symbol for the world around us. Everything runs, it operates. A clean, well-lighted place, but man is not at home, you see. Well, there he is wiping down the counter, thinking in Spanish, of course. And suddenly he stops, and he begins to say, Our nada who art in nada, nada be thy name, thy kingdom nada. Nada us this nada, our daily nada, as we nada those who... Well, nada means nothing, of course. And if you take any word, like watch, and say it over and over, it loses its meaning. Watch, 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 watch. See? Now if you take something like nada, or nothing, well, there's no meaning to begin with. Nothing has no reference, after all. And you're led to ultimate absurdity. Now, for Camus, this absurdity, as I said, this realization of the absurdity of life is a great opening out. Because if life is absurd, that means that there are no rules anymore to guide us or to hinder us, to dominate the way in which we are to act. And this means, above all, that we can no longer use as justification of any kind the sciences, traditional morality, or anything else. We can no longer use these things as excuses for bad faith, for irresponsibility towards one another. For example, look at this. There are these tyrannies of essence, these tyrannies of meaning. There are ways in which meaning control our lives in such a way that we are no longer egos or individuals at all. For example, there's the tyranny of good sense. We have to make sense. We are, after all of us right now, in a common linguistic heritage. I have to speak English to you. And that English is dominated by the rules of syntax. I can utter a statement like, quadruplicity breeds procrastination. Or that's Russell's famous. Quadruplicity drinks procrastination. I can't make a statement like that. It violates the rules of syntax. See? So I've got to make good sense. Now, see how this tyranny has restricted someone like James Joyce, for example, who penetrated far more deeply into consciousness than anyone making good sense ever could have. I don't have to offer names to you. If we were in my classroom, I would. I don't want to offend anyone. But one thing that the existentialists opposed to this tyranny of good sense, was the idea of contradictoriness. After all, the tyranny of good sense uses as its guiding principle, undoubtedly the 11th commandment, Aristotle's law of non-contradiction. You see, thou shalt not make statements such that A is A and not A. A cannot be A and not A. Thou wilt make good sense before thou wilt speak. One must, after all. You see. And now suddenly, the existentialists are aware that some of the most profound statements are statements which, on the surface, make no sense whatever. For example, there's the statement of Bertrand Russell with which he characterized, throwing up his hands at the same time, characterized the standpoint of George Santayana, who was a materialist and also a Catholic. And Russell was supposed to have said something like, you know, Georgie, you think there is no God and Mary is his mother. And I don't know what Santayana's reaction was, but of course it characterizes Santayana's viewpoint in a very profound, very meaningful way, because Santayana wants both sides of that. He wants the concept that there is no God, and he wants the concept that Mary is his mother. You see. For other human beings, for others of us, this sort of thing poses problems which we can't reconcile. For example, the Church of Notre Dame in Paris has its usual services on Sunday, and then after those services, it has another service pour les artistes, in which nothing is said, only the music is played. And we no longer have to make any kind of commitment to belief, or nobody has communion or listens to the Mass or anything like that. They just sit there and enjoy. Well, of course, this is what Santayana loved. Santayana loved the music and the incense, you see. And it was true. There is no God, and Mary is his mother. Both can be true. Niels Bohr, the Danish physicist, pointed out once in a seminar that there are really two kinds of truth. Now, of course, for us Anglo-American logicians, truth is truth. Statements the true, false, nonsense. Those things, two kinds of truth, man. It's done, you see. But for Bohr, there are two kinds of truth. There is small truth and great truth. Small truth, of course, is characterized by the fact that it does obey the law of non-contradiction. The opposite of a small truth is a falsehood. It is either Wednesday today or it isn't. But the opposite of a great truth is another truth. And of course, this has been found to be so. Hegel pointed this out time after time. All the great ones. Freud can point this out. Freud can show us that we can have simultaneous love and hate with regard to the same object. And Rousseau can point out something like the insight that man is born free and yet he is in chains. My favorite little paradox is a line in Dylan Thomas's radio play, Under Milk Wood, in which Polygata says, "Isn't life a terrible thing, thank God?" I'll repeat that. In Dylan Thomas's play, Under Milk Wood, one of the characters, it's a story of a Welsh town. One of the characters, a girl named Polygata, who's had I don't know how many kids by I don't know how many different nun-husbands, says, "Isn't life a terrible thing, thank God?" In a movie that I saw recently, a biography of Benjamin Disraeli, played by George Arliss, Disraeli says supposed to have said something like, "All women should marry, and no man." I had a recent discussion with a very eminent philosopher who lives with the law of non-contradiction. He says, now wait a minute. By marry, you mean marriage between people of different sexes. Yes, of course. Well, then how is it possible that all women should marry and no man? Well, of course, it's not as paradoxical as all that when you look into it. All that the statement really says is that marriage suits women perfectly and men not at all, you see. That's the meaning of it. So it's possible, you see, that these apparent paradoxes are perhaps not as paradoxical as they might appear, and that they might also point out very profound, very great truths in Niels Bohr's sense. For example, in Catholicism, God is one, yet three. This is impossible to conceive. And even the Catholics, even Thomas Aquinas admits it. It's unthinkable. There was an early Christian, I believe in the 3rd century, a man named Tertullian, who was famous for this kind of utterance. I don't know why they never canonized him. He was a great writer. He set up a distinction between faith and reason, which is very reminiscent of Kierkegaard and the other existentialists. With faith, I believe. With reason, I know. What's the relation between the two? Well, if I know that there is an electric current flowing through this microphone, then that knowledge no longer involves faith, no longer calls for faith. If I don't know, then my faith is called for. Now, if we take this to its extreme, we find that faith is really called for where knowledge is impossible, where knowledge is absolutely out of the question. And that's why Tertullian can say something like this: God born of a woman? the idea is ridiculous. That's why I believe it. God coming down in the body of a man, the idea is absurd. That's why I believe it. And Kierkegaard makes a similar point. Kierkegaard says that truth is inwardness, and religion is inwardness. Now, of course, you can see this in the light of 19th century Romanticism and Schwärmerei and Schubert and that kind of business. But that's not what Kierkegaard means at all. Inwardness to him is something very, very painful and not in any way satisfying. And that's almost the test of it. It hurts like hell. It is hell for him. Now, for Kierkegaard, therefore, the ultimate basis of religion is paradox. Not truth, not sense, not meaning, but paradox. And unless you have this paradoxical feeling, you see, you are not in a religious consciousness at all, or in a religious state in any way. Now, what's another tyranny of essence? Another kind of tyranny is that imposed by the sciences. The sciences, of course, are riddled with das Man, with generalities, with what one does. When we go to physicians, we are not individuals, we're cases. As a matter of fact, we're cases all over the place. We're cases in any contact with the official world. Go and apply for unemployment insurance, and you're a case, and not an individual at all. Well, of course, the sciences have made all this possible, you see. Science uses as the model of its explanation, the kind of explanation that the sciences give, the mechanistic model. Now, this means that things are explained in terms of antecedent conditions. I turn on the generator, the light goes on. Why does the light go on? The generator went on before it, you see. Now, this creates what's known as a deterministic picture. Once you know what all the antecedent conditions are in any given situation, once you understand what the cause and effect relations are in any situation, it is impossible for the result to be otherwise, to be other than it is. Now let's take this onto the human level. When we're understood in any of the social sciences, when we are understood by a Freud, when we are understood by a Marx, the pattern of explanation that is given is completely deterministic. There is no possibility here for freedom. There is no possibility here for individuality. Every one of our actions is an embodiment of an essence, an example of an essence, an instance, see, of a general law. And that's all that we are. Therefore, for the Freudians, we are never free. So, if I commit a violent act and I'm arrested, and the judge has the suspicion that I might be psychopathic, he sends me to, some sort of clinician. If the man has a deterministic way of explaining what I did, then what happens is that in this deterministic explanation, he relieves me of the responsibility for my acts. He makes me unfree. I threw the rock through the window. Why? Well, my throwing the rock through the window is the result of every item of conditioning that I have ever experienced. If you were to understand every one of those vectors, every one of those items of conditioning, then you would have to realize that I couldn't possibly have done anything but what I did. So, when I kill, I am not responsible. When I throw the rock through the window, I am not responsible. In no case ever am I responsible for what I do. That is, if I take a scientific way of explaining myself. See. For Marx, this is the same, and for social scientists in general. They don't like to admit that the deterministic scheme is their goal. But this is what is implied in their scientific attitude as such. If we could understand completely, we'd know exactly what the next moment would bring. Now, existentialism has found a way of opposing this. What existential psychology tries to show is that yes, we are free. We are not dominated by hidden unconscious impulses over which we have no control. And, furthermore, if we want to use the concept of these hidden, dark, unknowable impulses, we are acting in bad faith. It's as though I were to, hit you in the face and say, listen, if you were to understand everything that's gone into my makeup, you'd excuse it, wouldn't you? Of course. Here's another. Bam. See? I'm not responsible. How can any of us be responsible? I'm not responsible at all. See? Absolutely not. If you want to take a really rational attitude, I'm not responsible. See? Now, existentialism tries to show that, yes, we are responsible. And as I suggested, it has built up a kind of psychoanalysis opposed to the Freudian concept, of an unconscious mind. This, for Jean-Paul Sartre, in a book called The Transcendence of the Ego, this, for Sartre, is unthinkable. A mind, by definition, is consciousness, a form of consciousness. There cannot be such a thing as an unconscious mind. Neither can there be such a thing as an ego in the sense of a function or a mechanism or some little operative device, a little engineer throwing switches. For Sartre, that's impossible. And of course, you can understand why it's impossible for him. Because Sartre is, besides being a philosopher, also a novelist. And if you've ever written a novel, you know that one of the most awkward and embarrassing things to write is a first-person stream of consciousness account. Think of how your own thinking goes on when you're thinking by yourself. Not deliberating, mind you, not thinking of a problem, but just walking down the street. One doesn't say, I feel hungry. I think I will have a hamburger and a Pepsi. I think I will go to a movie. No, one says something like hungry, Pepsi, hamburger, movie. You don't say I. The I is therefore a construction, a device which the Freudians, you see, have retained in order to make the whole business workable somehow. So, in opposition to the deterministic picture that the sciences provide, existentialism insists on and emphasizes the role of human freedom. As a matter of fact, it can be said that the function of existentialism vis-a-vis the sciences and vis-a-vis intellectual endeavors in general is to expose them all as pieces of bad faith and to make room once more for human freedom and human responsibility, because only by presupposing human freedom can we presuppose such a thing as a morality altogether. Now, what about morality itself? Well, traditionally, we've got things like the Ten Commandments and the Golden Rule and Kant's categorical imperative and things of that sort. Now, what is the nature of a commandment? Well, somebody tells you, and you behave. How moral is that, actually? Suppose that we find one of the guards who worked in Auschwitz, and we bring him up to trial, and we say, listen, you were working there. Now, you all know what his defense will be. I was merely following orders, right? I only followed orders. I was a small cog in the big machine. I only followed orders. Now, here is Moses. Or now that God is dead, I should say. Here's Charlton Heston with the Ten Commandments. And the Ten Commandments say, thou shalt, and thou shalt not. Now, if we obey commands, and if we merely obey, then how moral are we? Kierkegaard pointed out that in order to be properly religious, we have to transcend even traditional morality. Of course, it's one of the functions of organized religion to institutionalize our moral values. And Kierkegaard, in a book called Fear and Trembling. This is a good contrast to the usual kind of title that the German pedantic scholars came out with. 14 volumes of introduction into something or other, you see. Kierkegaard's titles are all very, very gutsy. Sickness unto death, fear and trembling, either or. Very, very powerful, you see. Now in this book, Fear and Trembling, he describes a very familiar situation. Abraham hears a voice. It is the voice of God. God says to Abraham, Abraham! And Abraham answers with the word hineni, which means something like, it doesn't even mean here I am, because that already asserts I. It's something which negates I altogether. It means something like, look for me in the dust, or something like that. You see. Here I am. All right. And the voice says, now take your son. And of course, you have to remember that not only did he love his son, as any father would, but this kid was the last hope of everything. Right? After all, Sarah had this child long beyond the age of having children. And he was already, how old was Abraham when Isaac was born? Very, very old. Now here's Isaac, an adolescent. And the voice commands that Abraham take Isaac, make a 3-day trip, saddle up 2 donkeys, take firewood and a slave, and your son, make a 3-day trip to Mount Moriah. When you get there, kill him. Now, an ethical human being, Kierkegaard says, an ethical human being, someone living with the 10 Commandments, right? Thou shalt not kill. Huh? Someone living with Kant's categorical imperative, someone living with the Golden Rule, would have said, oh, what am I supposed to do? I can't kill somebody. I've just been commanded not to. I mean, how can anybody? It's terrible. You can't kill people just because you hear a voice. God, you might be deceived. The voice could be anything. And kill? What kind of God is it that asks me to do such a thing? But Abraham, of course, is not a philosopher. And he's not even a character. He's not even an ego. This is a writer named Emil Auerbach in a book called Mimesis, who points out that there is only one character in the Bible, and that's God. The Bible is not interested in what Abraham is going through. Not a sentence is uttered about the anguish that Abraham must be experiencing these 3 days. He hasn't read the script, after all. He doesn't know that when he'll get there, the angel will come and save the kid. He doesn't know this, you see. Now, Kierkegaard points out that what Abraham is doing is not an ethical act, but a religious act. And religion has to transcend even the ethical. Because at the religious stage, you see, we no longer have justification. We no longer have a vindication in any way at all. Abraham, of course, is completely responsible. He can't even say, God told me. Not if he's really religious. He has complete freedom and complete responsibility. And this is, of course, the point at which Sartre leaves us. Religion is bad faith for Sartre. Why? Because it's a way out. Suppose somebody, when the whole Vietnam absurdity is over, someone catches you and says, didn't you kill somebody? I saw you killing somebody. You say, well, Johnson told me. Well, that's bad faith too, isn't it? In a way. Even though it's true that Johnson says, and we do. So, as against traditional morality, therefore, existentialism suggests something like a complete responsibility and what Kierkegaard calls the teleological suspension of the ethical. Not the theological, but the teleological suspension of the ethical. Now, where are we in all this? Well, existentialism has really 2 aspects. The aspect that is usually emphasized is this negative, destructive aspect, the aspect which shows conventional morality to be bad faith or inadequate in some other respect, the aspect or the attitude under which Nietzsche says God is dead, or in which someone like Hemingway points to the absurdity of the world. The absurdity for Camus is a split, a divorce between man and his meaning, between man's essence and man's existence. And this is something very good, as I emphasized already, and something very positive. The real way to live is to keep absurdity alive and to show that there's no rule that binds. That way you're completely free. How can you do this? Well, you must stay aware, as Heidegger points out, that you are always a being pointed towards death, that you are a Sein zum Tode. And this is the great liberating force. It is this, after all, which makes art and love and creativity necessary and also possible. St. Augustine in the 5th century points out that if we were to live forever, if we were eternal, then all human virtue would merely be a question of time. You just have to stick around and all your problems would be solved. Just have to wait long enough. You've got forever. You'd learn, get degree after degree, psychoanalysis after psychoanalysis. All problems everything would be tried, you see. But the fact that we are not eternal, the fact that our life is finite, makes it necessary for us to create meaning, not to find it, not to find essences, and to accept essences as imposed by the culture, but to create them. And we create them only because life is absurd. There's a wonderful anecdote that Camus relates in the myth of Sisyphus, and it's reflected also in a Buddhist parable. The story that Camus tells is this. Here is a man jumping off a skyscraper and committing suicide. There he is. Let's say that it's from the roof of the Empire State Building. Right? He's got 102 floors to go. It's quite a while. And he's falling. And as he falls and approaches the sidewalk, at which point he will be smashed, he notices that it's a nice day in June. And the moment before impact, what does he see on the sidewalk? A shoelace. A shoelace. The Buddhist parable is somewhat like this. Here's a man who's fallen off a cliff. This time, of course, his death is not by choice. It's inadvertent. He slipped, fell off a cliff. And in his fall, he gropes around wildly, and he hits on something. He grasps a branch, and he's hanging there. And he looks down, and it's 1,000 feet down. And he looks up, and it's 1,000 feet up, straight up. Hopeless. No handhold or anything. He's hanging there. There's no possibility of escape, of help in any way. As he's hanging, he notices that the branch that he's hanging from is beginning to give way. There's a slight trickle of sand coming out of the crevice that the branch is rooted in. His weight is drawing it out. There's no way of eliminating one's own weight. His feet can't reach for anything. He can't stand on anything. The branch is giving way. Now, what would a Buddhist do? And what would a Westerner do? A Westerner would, in the words of that comedian, who is he? He would cry a lot. Right, Jose Jimenez. He would cry a lot. Why? Well, because the most precious thing in the world is about to be lost. The me, the ego. That which will never again appear. Because the religions tell us that it's once only. It's unique, you see. But what does the Buddhist do? The Buddhist hangs there from the branch and notices this little flower, this marigold, a very humble flower, in another little crevice. And before the branch is ripped out completely and he's plunged into oblivion, he leans over and sniffs it. Now, this of course leads to the positive aspect. Camus, in the myth of Sisyphus, felt that once we could make ourselves aware somehow of this absurdity, then it would be possible to, well, as he put it, embrace the pagan joys of simply being alive, of simple existence, without essences, without meanings being imposed beforehand. I think I must end here in an effort to give this a kind of meaning and structure, you see, because otherwise we'll go on. So if there are any questions, I'll be happy to answer them if I can.
All right, thank you very much. Very nice job indeed.